Hello, everyone. Welcome to my house. I'm Carol Costello. I teach journalism at LMU. I advise at the LA Loyola 2020 election team, and I mentor students at LMU and also at my alma mater, Kent State University in Ohio. But for most of my life, until 2 years ago, I was a working journalist. Most recently, I worked for CNN as an anchor and correspondent, and I covered a ton of presidential elections, Bush, Obama, and yes, in 2016, I covered Mr. Trump's run for president. I have 1 million stories. So, where to start? I could tell you all that's wrong with political journalism today and then look at you and shake my head and say, hey, it's up to your generation to fix it. I've said that in the past. Hey, students, you figure it out. But I'm not going to say that to you now. Instead, I'm going to tell you what it's like to make split-second decisions in the vitriolic, boiling hot mess America has become. I'm not going to make excuses or tell you what's right or wrong. I'm just going to tell you what it's like to be a journalist today. I'm going to outline a few points. Number one, the responsibility journalists bear. Two, how the media influences elections. Three, what it's like to be a reporter today. And four, my dream vision for what journalism ought to encompass. First up, I'd like to tackle responsibility. Journalists, whether they report on television, in print, digital, or on social media, have big platforms. And with those platforms comes huge responsibility. Because of your platform and how many eyes are on that platform, you have the ability to affect people's lives, their health, even whether they live or die. It is our job to responsibly report on COVID and leave politics out of it. Because if we don't, if we give people bad information, they could die. I could go on, but you get it. If you have a big platform, you have the power to change things. And with that comes enormous responsibility. The major point here, if you are a journalist with a moral compass, you carry the weight of that responsibility with you into the field. My second point, journalists can influence elections. And I have 4 subpoints to go along with that. And I'd like to thank the University of Oregon for their research into this project, this topic rather, because it kind of helped me focus. So subpoint number one, the media decides which candidates to cover. So how might that affect elections? Well, the biggest thing that drives elections is name recognition. That was noticeable during the Republican primaries leading up to 2016. Anybody remember Jim Gilmore? Jim Gilmore? I didn't think so. He ran in the Republican primary against Mr. Trump. Nobody covered Mr. Gilmore. Everybody focused on Donald Trump, mostly because Donald Trump was interesting. He definitely managed to remain interesting by saying the most outrageous things, things no other political candidate would ever say.
That guy's got a serious weight problem. Go home, start exercising. Get him out of here, please. Got a bigger problem than I do. Got a bigger problem than all of us. Now he goes home and his mom says, "What the hell have you just done?"
Remember that? Well, the media was gobsmacked. They were trapped in this state of who says that? And instead of delving into Mr. Trump's record, as a businessman, the media remained in a state of who says that? And largely remained in that state until the end. Subpoint number two, the media influences elections through bias and the country's polarization. And what do I mean by that? Major media outlets attract partisan audiences. Fox attracts Republicans, CNN attracts mostly Democrats, MSNBC, they pretty much attract all Democrats. This reflects political biases in their coverage. It does. And you say that's bad, right? Before you make that snap judgment, consider this. Today's news consumers can get basic facts from an internet search. They don't need a TV news organization to get the facts. That means news organizations have had to figure out a way to attract an audience in other ways. That's meant shifting part of your election coverage away from straight news, just the facts, ma'am, and focusing on analysis and opinions. And that's worked from a rating standpoint. CNN does straight news, yes, but it has all those panelists with analysis. CNN's primetime is highly emotionally charged, right? Chris Cuomo and Don Lemon come to mind. Fox is all opinion all the time in prime time. They don't need panels. But for a network like CNN that prides itself on delivering truth, combining straight journalism with opinion, emotion, and constant analysis is tricky, but it's proved worth it. Ratings are sky high. And remember, always remember, news is a public service, but it's also a business that needs money to survive. CNN is getting eyeballs. Those eyeballs translate to money. And let's face it, if no one watches your product, does any of what you report really matter? My next subpoint. Social media is complicating things for journalists. That's the understatement of the year, right? According to Pew, 62% of Americans get their news via social media platforms. But those consumers don't realize that the news they see on social media is heavily filtered. What you see on Facebook is largely dictated by algorithms that decide what you see based on what you like and dislike. So rather than getting a diversity of perspectives that contribute to political discourse, we just see this echo chamber, one that creates confusion and distrust when those social media users turn on the TV news and see something that totally contradicts what they just saw in their Facebook feed. It creates a dilemma for journalists. A, it's impossible to know what people are seeing on Facebook, so how do you refute it or prove it? And B, if you don't report on it, people assume it's true and you're not telling them about it for some nefarious reason. That creates distrust, and that can sway voters in a way journalists never intended. My final subpoint on how the media influences elections. Visual images, pictures. Visuals are more impactful than the written word. Sorry, writers, that's just true. There's plenty of research out there that proves it. Images of political candidates convey emotion, actions, realism, and credibility. They leave a lasting impression in the mind of the voting public. And who often captures those images and who decides which of those images to use on the air? News organizations. I know images do appear on social media and they're way more crazy. But I would posture people expect to see crazy things online. Pictures gain credibility when they make it onto mainstream TV. And yes, that holds true even today when there is distrust in the mainstream media. My fourth and final example of how the media influences elections is this. The media is the watchdog of democracy. Mr. Trump is already saying the coming election is rigged. Mail-in voting is fraudulent, even though there's very little evidence to support that. It's the media's job to inform, to educate. If journalists don't responsibly do this in a purely factual way, democracy dies. Democracy dies. And that's not an understatement, that's just the truth. So now you get it. The media has an enormous influence. And if you sit back and you really think about that, you realize if you have that moral center, it's kind of scary to be a reporter, to shoulder that enormous responsibility. So, again, what's it like? What's it like to shoulder that responsibility in the world we live in today? We are a country divided. We're not shy in attacking one another. Some think it's fun and effective and bending people to our will. That's because so many of us live in a bubble where we see only what we want to. That means we don't care to hear about the other side. We're quick to discount anything that disturbs our comfy life in our protected bubble. So when we hear journalists refuting aspects of life in the bubble bath, it can make us angry, resentful, suspicious. So, what's it like to be a working political journalist? I'll boil it down to three words first. It is hard. It is hard. Hear me out. Every day, you are presented with a series of tough decisions you have to make in the moment. Information comes fast. You often don't have time to sit around a table and think about what you're going to say. Like it or not, news is 24/7, and that's never going to change. You have to feed the beast fast with all of the responsibility you carry as a journalist, even though many newsrooms are operating with fewer resources. Our political arena is so outrageous. It is outrageous. It's so outrageous, it's difficult to maintain an air of objectivity, especially when no one quite knows what objectivity means anymore. We often equate objectivity with presenting two sides of the story because, gosh, every story has to have more than one side, right? Journalists who strive for accuracy and fairness are strongly committed to telling both sides of the story in a balanced way. And that's commendable. But sometimes there aren't two sides to a story. Racism is wrong. There is no other side of that story. White supremacists are not very fine people. Sometimes the truth is just the truth. If you find yourself struggling to come up with that other side of the story, you're likely presenting a false equivalency. What's that? False equivalency. If more than 90% of scientists say the Earth is warming and only 3% say it's not, the Earth is warming. Let me repeat. When more than 97% of scientists have shared peer-reviewed evidence the Earth is warming, the planet is getting hotter. I didn't make those stats up. That's according to NASA. If you want to read all those peer-reviewed papers from all of those scientists, NASA has them online. But you say you want to be fair. I mean, what about that 3%? Don't they deserve to be heard just a little? Well, here's the thing. I know because science tells me the world is round. But there are people who think the world is flat. They call themselves the Flat Earth Society. Should I, as a fact-based journalist, report the flat earthers' assertion that all the scientific peer-reviewed evidence that shows the world is round is wrong? Let's say I'm anchoring a show and I assemble a panel of experts, one of whom believes the world is flat. The flat earther is sitting right next to an astronaut who has seen our big round planet from his spacecraft. If I, as a trusted anchor, put that flat earther right beside that astronaut on my show, I'm telling my audience, hey, this flat earther is just as smart and informed as this astronaut. And since my audience trusts me, they're likely to buy it. See, I'm giving that flat earther credibility, even though he has none. I'm presenting my audience with a false equivalency, and I'm doing them a great disservice. So what does that have to do with covering political news today? When you hear a politician accuse another of a serious infraction to deflect attention from their own alleged misdoings, you must consider if the accusation is really worth investigating or if it's a false equivalency. Since many people today want to believe the stuff in their bubble, even when there's no evidence to prove it, they don't understand why you're not presenting them with one false equivalency after another. It's also called whataboutism. Well, Mr. Trump said this, but what about that thing Mr. Biden said? Well, Mr. Biden said that, but what about that thing that Mr. Trump said? Part of my job as a journalist is to ignore the whataboutism and investigate the matter at hand. Many viewers don't get that, and they chalk it up to unfair, biased coverage when it's not. It's doubly hard when so many things in our political world are not normal. It's also a journalist's job to point that out. It's not normal for an American president to campaign from the White House Rose Garden and say his opponent wants to do away with the suburbs and windows. It's not normal for a US Attorney General to clear the streets of peaceful protesters to make way for a presidential photo op. Still, Mr. Trump has his ardent supporters who simply don't care. So it's tough to project an aura of objectivity and get across to your audience that this is not normal, especially when so many abnormal things are happening. They now seem to be normal. Allow me to take this one step farther so you can better understand. The president's pressers on COVID, his presidential news conferences, TV news outlets traditionally carry those presidential press conferences because president imparts important information to the public. So President Trump's presidential pressers began with scientists, right? They were right by his side, and they were allowed to talk to the American people. But as time went on and COVID spread, and Mr. Trump's approval ratings were taking a dive, Mr. Trump began contradicting his own scientists in real time on live television. He even suggested injecting bleach might cure COVID. This is not normal. This is dangerous. Calls to poison control centers spiked in New York, Illinois, and Maryland. So, how should a news organization handle these pressers? Remember, we have vast platforms and huge responsibility. Do you stop taking the president's pressers live? Do you fact check them in real time? Do you only carry or air parts of the presser that are science based? Keep in mind that bubble, where many viewers are convinced you are contradicting a man who is always right because he lives in your bubble. You can't ignore them as a journalist. You also have the responsibility to engage them, inform them, do them a public service. At the same time, it's imperative you call the president out when he's spewing nonsense. It doesn't matter if his name is Trump, Clinton, or Obama. If you don't, you are normalizing irresponsible, abnormal behavior. We live in a world where so many news watchers are passive or who get a skewed view of world events from social media or political pundits. We've reached the point where, and this is just my own opinion, we've reached the point where journalists can no longer afford to present the news dispassionately. I can guess what the news bosses at CNN would say after Mr. Trump vocalized his idea to use bleach to kill COVID. They would tell their anchors, call him out, and then hammer it home. Make viewers understand that this action by a president is not only not normal, it's dangerous. That's why you that's why you see CNN covering the same topic hour after hour after hour. I'm going to wrap this up now with my dream of vision. I would love for all political persuasions, for people of all political persuasions, to make an effort to understand journalism and its role in America and its challenges. And I would love for news organizations to figure out how to regain the trust of all people, no matter their political persuasion. It's a tall order in a crazy news cycle, but I believe. And yeah, it is up to your generation to fix it, but it's up to my generation to fix it too. We're in this together. We have to work together to fix this. And I believe that we can, and you should too. Thank you.